excuse me, is
Sorry, forgot to do that.
how do plants and animals interact? And so the learning outcome that students are required to report on is that students analyze and describe how plants and animals interact with each other and their environment. Of course, below that are the columns of the knowledge and understanding, skills and processes, fondly known as CUSPs in the education world. If you haven't heard that, then you'll be hearing that many times as the curriculum unfolds. So we're going to be taking a look at how to better understand the outcomes and how to better meet them in this session. We did mention in the first one that there are some words that you may come across and some ways that the outcomes are organized. You may just want to keep in mind, anytime you see the word include, anything that comes after the word include is expected to be taught. At the bottom, if you see something like such as, what follows are just examples, and you could use them, use some of them, all of them, that bring in your own examples in as well. And every once in a while, there'll be a word in parentheses. That word is meant to be used, and the kids are expected to learn and use that word. But there are some age-appropriate languages along with it. Eventually, we want the kids to be using the word, however, that's in the parentheses. So if we can get them to using that word, the sooner the better. That's, I think, what we're looking at there. So we also, as we're unpacking this curriculum, I think it's really important to keep in mind that a curriculum is a curriculum is a curriculum, and that we as educators have a huge role to play in what happens in our classroom with that curriculum. I'm not going to dwell on this, but we know that our future is very unpredictable, and it's almost a cliche, and I just hate to say it, but I just have to remind us that it's changing rapidly. We don't know what kind of world, what kind of skills our kids are going to need. I remember hearing that 10 years ago, and it seems that the pace is picking up quicker. You know, when I was more in the classroom, it was like 20 years from now, we're not going to need to know what our kids are going to, we don't know what they're going to need to know or be able to do. And now it's almost like every few years, we don't know what are the key skills. So it's moving very rapidly. And in that context, I think what we have to understand is that we as the teachers can influence very much who our kids are and what they come out of our classrooms with. The curriculum gives us some foundational things we need to work with, but by intentionally choosing appropriate teaching strategies, intentionally choosing appropriate assessment strategies, we can make a huge difference on the type of students we have. We want them to be critical thinkers, creative thinkers, innovators, good citizens, all those things that don't necessarily show up directly in a curriculum. But if we go to the next slide, we know that that's part of what we need to do as teachers. The things I just mentioned and the things that really, I think, matter when we really think about the big picture is all those competencies. We want our kids to be like that. We think those things are going to give them the best bet for success in the future, along with literacy skills and numeracy skills. And so those things are expected to be embedded in the lessons as they go along. And we can't embed them in our lessons by then going through the curriculum in a checkbox manner and saying, okay, I've done this, my kids know this, know this. We know that when it comes to learning, there's a surface knowing, a deep knowing, and a knowing to transfer. And by using appropriate instructional approaches, we can meet that target. So I'd like to begin that process by looking at the curriculum once again, just through two lenses. The first conceptual lens I'd like to look at is through the lens of the concept. Concept we know is a noun, it's an organizing idea of one or two words. A chair is a concept because it has distinct attributes, and we know that there's a multitude of examples of different kind of chairs. So a chair is a chair is a chair, whether it's a dining chair, 2 legs, 3 legs, we know that as long as you can sit in it, and it's manufactured for sitting, we can call it a chair. So let's take a look at a part of the curriculum right now. The identifier up there is wrong. It should be 4 life skills, not 3 life skills, and I think the number is wrong. But the outcome is the same though. Students analyze and describe how plants and animals interact with each other and with the environment. And when I say using a concept lens really helps us to focus things, that's what I'd like to practice right now, is look at that outcome and look at the cusps and see if you can see any of the key concepts that may pop out at you. You can use, if you have your numbered copy with you, you can underline or circle them if you want. Feel free to jot any down in the chat box if you see them. We'll take a look right away, but just in your mind, what are the key concepts? What jump out at you? And you might have noticed these. So Chris, if we can go on to the next slide.
Yep.
I've highlighted the key ones, and you can see that they're pretty much repeated throughout the knowledge and understanding and skills. We've got plants and animals, environment, organisms is one that carries through as well. Functions is another one that carries through. So just by looking at that, we know that those are some key ideas and concepts that in order for students to understand external structures, organism, and functions, they need to know certain things, and they can understand by doing certain things with them. So the knowledge, understanding, and skills and procedures go well together. But when you take you can take another continued hard look at the curriculum through the lens of conflict concepts, and other concepts are going to pop out at you. Some other ideas are very skill related, and we don't recognize them because they're just that. We see them as verbs. But if we're going to analyze something, what we really have as a concept behind that is an analysis. So what is an analysis? We analyze something to produce an analysis. What is that thing? What's a description when we describe? What is that? And you can see there's some other ones that I haven't highlighted, not hoping that you might be able to find them. But if someone was to investigate something, such as in the skills and procedure, we would look at the concept related to that being an investigation. And same if students are discussing, we want to make sure they understand what a discussion is and what the procedures and everything are along with that. So by looking through at concepts, we can really get a better idea of what to focus on and what we need to practice over and over again with the kids. Like all concepts are organized hierarchically from very general and to very more specific ones. So we have animals, a broad concept, and narrowing down to deer, and then we can get to specific kind of deer, such as mule deer, white-tailed deer, and so on. And keeping that in mind, then we can take all the concepts out of the grade 4 organizing idea, living systems, and organize them into a concept map. I do have that concept map available for you in another document I will share, but a concept map is a good way for ourselves and for the students to see where we are in the unit. Take a look and see how all the ideas are connected. And certainly as you go through, you could bring in other, once we have been going on this, bring in some of the other concepts that kids maybe learned in 1 or 2 or 3 and tell them where would they tag on to this, because there are some concepts from those grades that would tag on to this. Because we do know that the more students understand the structural knowledge of a discipline and the concepts behind it, the more expert they become in that subject. Next slide, please. So at the end of the day, we provide kids with a solid understanding of concepts. We can have them look at their world then through a conceptual lens. They can understand their world differently based on the conceptual lens that we give them. And the more we emphasize a solid foundation of the concepts, the more they can transfer their understanding to different situations. So here, maybe at the end of the whole unit, you may want to ask your students to, hey, take a look at these pictures and look at it through the lens of external structure and see what they come up with. Maybe they would use the lens of sensing and what might they notice, or protecting and what might they notice. Or maybe throw some grade 3 concepts in there if you're familiar with what they were, if they've gone through, if this was a progression of this curriculum through the course of the last few years. So a conceptual lens is a good way to get students to look at things to focus in on as well. But I'd like to move on looking at the curriculum from the lens of the concepts to a skills conceptual lens. We know that's on the right-hand column of the curriculum, and it's the doing words. They're the verbs, and typically they're thinking or an action, like demonstrating respect or doing something that's observable. So let's just take a look at skills and procedures associated with this unit. They're listed, they're bolded in black. And you'll notice that with compare, I put and contrast. I looked through the curriculum to see how many times compare and contrast is used. In kindergarten, compare and contrast is used. Grade 6 is compare and contrast. And in the other grades in between, including grade 4, it's just compare. I think we have to, we slice and dice. Compare simply means looking for similarities. Contrast is differences. We're not going to start doing that. Just when we see the word compare, we're going to take it as comparison and contrast. But you can see all those, all the key verbs that are expected to be used in the skills and procedures part. But I would like to share with you a couple of tips as you're looking at those and planning around them. The first tip is to clarify the skill, because noticing as we go through the guide, the same word or verb may be used differently depending on the context. So I think it's a really good idea to have a dictionary or Google beside you to help you out with this. And here's what I mean. If you go to the next slide, in a lot of the outcomes, the word identify is used. And identify can mean different things depending on how it's used. If we take a look at the very bottom, we see in one of the grade 3 outcomes, it says identify where fossilized bones are on display in Alberta. Well, really means to state, like where are they? We're going to state where they're, we're going to identify the locations. But if we were to take a look at identify the way it's used in the grade 4 outcome, it says find examples of local plants and identify their external structures. Well, it's nothing they're going to have memorized. They're going to be identifying that by what they see. And we know that internal structures or external structures can be things like existence of fur, perhaps, existence of appendages, and so on. And those really are concepts. In other words, they're going to have to classify what they see as feathers or hair or fur or whatever they see. So that's more of a classification. And we know that one of the outcomes right under that, they do use the word classify, such as classify animals by external structures. If you go to the next slide, I don't want to do too much parsing here or anything. And this is just there to see how the words are sometimes used interchangeably. So just be careful. In this slide, identify the external structure of these animals. You can be looking at things you'd probably identify if you go to the next slide. They'd be the same things if we said classify the external structures of these animals that you did here. So we know that they could mean the same thing. And why does it all matter? Next slide, please. Because we're going to have to clarify your intention of what you want to do with these things. If you know it's a skill and instead of just a stating thing, then what you want to do is separate the skill part from the knowledge part of the statement. If we take a look at one of the skill statements in this unit, it states compare external structures of various plants and animals in relation to its functions. Well, there's a skill part, compare, and then a knowledge part, something that they need to know. Plants, animals, function, external structures. So we want to separate them out. If we're going to assess the knowledge part of that and the concepts, we want to make sure that they understand what the skill comparing is. On the other hand, if you want to assess the skill of comparing and contrasting, then you want to make sure that they know what comparing and contrasting is. You want to use information and practice that's not course content, not content they're related to, so that there's not a competition of attention from the kids, and you could just focus on the skill at hand. So keep in mind there's both parts. Keep in mind your intention of what you want to focus on. Now, next slide, please, Chris. It really does matter to know what the skills are and to think about what they are. Because if you take a look at the learning outcome, the main learning outcome that we're going to be reporting on, it says students analyze and describe how plants and animals interact with the world and their environment. Yet when we look at the list of the skills, there's the word analyze doesn't show up anywhere. So how are we supposed to assess that and report to parents when the word analyze doesn't show up? And that's why I said, we got to look close at the skills, what they mean, because really when you stop and think about when you classify something, you really have to analyze it. You have to, and that's what analysis is. You're looking at something closely and examining it. So you can't classify something unless you examine it, look at closely and say, aha, it has this kind of structure and then classified here. And so I just thought I'd throw you in there because that's one of the outcomes, but analyze doesn't show up. If we take a look at one of the other skills, comparing and contrasting, go to the next slide. Oh, it's going to go back one slide. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. That's fine. Keep it there. I'll just mention it. But even in the competency, it says students will analyze information as well. So the way I try to teach skills all the time is to first of all take a look, and I teach it in a skills teaching strategy component. There are several steps to it. You're going to get the slide. Don't write it all down. I'm just going to take you a quick run through it, not a big long one. But there are some key parts to it that I think can be really helpful, especially with a skill like comparing and contrasting. Number one, you want to be sure that you understand what a good definition of the skill is, so you can share it with your students and you can all have that same definition. So I define it, then identify the steps. Then when you identify the steps, you might say, hey, there's some concepts in these steps that I better stop and teach first before I go through the steps. And once you think all that, you got the steps. Then you go on, share the steps with the kids. Here's how you compare and contrast, and then model it for them. And if you take a look from steps 5 and down, it's just practice and exploring the skill deeper and deeper. So I'm going to give you a really quick run through right now with comparing and contrasting. A definition might be is that comparing and contrasting is determining how similar or different to a more people, things, or places are. Step 3 is really then looking for the steps. So here's the steps. Well, first of all, when we compare anything, we're going to have to establish criteria. What are we going to compare them on? You can compare apples and oranges because if you choose criteria, such as flavor or color and so on, we can compare and contrast them. Then once you got the criteria, you take a look at the two objects, you analyze it, you examine the two ideas, you're exploring it and record what your observations are, what you see for each criteria for each item. So if color was a criteria, we'd explore the apple, analyze the apple and say it's red, and analyze the orange and say it's orange, right? And then step 3 for each criteria, determine whether they're similar or different. Well, when it comes to color, an apple is red, an orange is orange, there's a difference. And then finally, once you go through all the criteria and analyze everything and gather your data, you're going to have a lot of similarities and differences. You're going to have to decide, well, these things are kind of the same, they're kind of the difference, or, they're really different. And then you could represent your understanding. So those are the steps. So if you take a look, so in the skills teaching strategy, number 1, define the skill, and then lay out the steps. And the step 3 is, well, what are some concepts in my skill or in my steps that the kids may have a hard time figuring out? Criteria might be one. Analyze, and I'm going to use that with my kids now because it's in the outcome. So analyze, what is it? They may not know what a conclusion is. So they're going to conclude something and they're going to determine something at the end of this whole thing. And then they're going to somehow represent it. And through the grade 4 and certainly the other curriculum, there is a lot, you'll see represent show up. What does it mean when you have to represent something? For this example, I'm going to pause and say, I'm assuming I know my kids know all those things except criteria. They don't know what it is. So there's several ways you could teach a concept. You can just tell them what it is, and we'll share some other ideas how. You can do a card sort. I like using something called the concept attainment practice, which we're going to do quickly right now. So if you go to the next slide, well, what I did here was given some examples of yes and no's. My yeses in my back of my mind when I'm applying this are criteria. So what are some criteria for deciding where your family is going to go for lunch? Are you going to go to a place depending on how clean it is, the cost, how far away it is? You could see that those are our criteria that someone might use. Some other thoughts may be if the restaurant starts with a Z. So you throw these ideas out there. You don't use the word criteria or say what's going to turn my thought, but you ask them now, if you're going to go to a restaurant, what is something else? You go to the next slide, Chris. What are some other ideas that you would put in the yes column? If you're going to go through a restaurant and think about where you're going to go, what would you think about? Well, you might think about what the menu is. Kids might have some other things. Well, I'd consider this. And so go to the next slide. After you explore that idea, then so, okay, right. Everything that's in the yes column is a criteria. So what is it? Let's define what a criteria is. And if you work with that, then the kids come up with the next slide with the solution. That criteria is, it's something we consider, we could think about when making a judgment or decision about something. All right. So all those things in the yes column will help us decide whether or not we're going to go, what restaurant we're going to go to. And so now that I know what the kids, what criteria is, then I can go through those 5 steps. And I would model those 5 steps that I shared with you earlier. And after I model, I'd be as a class, I'd be filling this out together. If the task was compare and contrast the external structures of these 2 animals in relation to function, here's what I might have. Now, Chris is going to take you to one very similar to this. I'm going through this one with you because I'm assuming my kids are going to be I want them to write a paragraph on this at the end. So I'm going to take them further than you might see Chris does with hers, which is totally fine because we're working, as you'll see, we're working at surface levels, deep levels, and transfer levels as we go along. So at the end of the day, you can see all the steps I've taken. There's the criteria, the analysis and description of each, the goldfish and the hawk, based on the criteria, for example, eating, the way the functions that I see for eating, external structures, excuse me, that I see for eating are different. Their structures for moving are different, protecting and sensing are different. At the end and at the bottom, I do have some contrast scales, or some compare contrast scales, because sometimes they're pretty gray, and the kids need some language to say, well, they're really different, or they're just kind of different, they're kind of similar. But then at the end of the day, I say, well, look at that last column. What do you see mainly? Well, those are all differences. They're all different. So we can conclude that based on their external, the function of their external structures, a goldfish and a hawk are pretty different. And finally, as part of so if you keep on going for me for a second, Chris, the next slide. When we get to strategy 6 or step 6, then like I said, the other steps I'm not going to go through. They're just guided practice. Use the practice whenever you can. Don't only use it in science. If you teach other subjects, if you're teaching language arts, give kids comparison and contrast practice in language arts, in math, so that they become automatic at it. And that's when you get them moving into that transfer, when you can change the context that they're comparing and contrasting, and do it frequently and intermittently. I have this up here because one of the things you can do to deepen their understanding of a thinking skill, and I'm using comparing and contrasting here, of course, is to ask questions or do something at the conceptual level and ask a question, well, how can criteria affect the conclusion of the comparison and contrast of 2 items? What if our criteria for the last comparison was comparing a hawk and a goldfish, was comparing other things such as color? We might find some similarities in color. If we said, the number of a penny, we could break it down and change the criteria and say, hey, we're coming up with some different conclusions if we choose different criteria. And that's just one way of teaching a skill. And I like it because it kind of lays it out and it helps the kids troubleshoot when they're stuck. And I'll show you what I mean by the next slide. Yeah, when we go back to the slide deck for me. Because if you take a look at, let's say I had the kids write a response to this. I want them to, what I used to do is teach humanities, and I would say, okay, I like do some writing in social studies too, or science, whatever I teach. And so I was looking for them to write their responses out. If you could see, I used to get responses like this, where the kids would just take the first item and describe it. The hawk has feathers to keep it warm and so on. And the second one, the fish is orange, its scales. So they're just a list of description words of what they are. And that's not what I was wanting kids to do. I want them to conclude whether they are the same or different based on the criteria. So if we go to the next slide, if we had those steps there, we could assess this differently. We can give kids some feedback. We can take a look at the response, say, hey, look, you know what? You did a really good job at step 2, analyzing it. I see you've got lots of information there. You've collected some good information, but what were some criteria that you were going to use to compare and contrast this with? I don't see it. You know, and I don't see a conclusion. Are they mostly the same or mostly different? You haven't given me a conclusion yet. So by going through the steps, it also helps us to give kids feedback when we're assessing them on these skills as well. And Chris, you can move on to the next slide. I alluded to this earlier that, you know, we take kids through a process of that surface, deep, and transfer. And what we're trying to unfold here is how to move kids with not only this curriculum, but any curriculum from the surface level, that understanding of the knowledge, the facts, what does comparing and contrasting mean? What does an external structure mean? What does function mean? They know that. And we could actually, you know, we could test them, we can give them a quiz, they can demonstrate that. But we want to get a deeper understanding of that. Being able to make connections with other things. What's the connection between function and movement? What's the connection between, what were some other ones? Senses and function. We want to make those connections. And then finally, we want them to transfer their understanding to new contexts. So we may be working with plants and animals in Alberta to start with, but let's transfer that to other plants and animals that they may have never seen before. So in order to go with that, through those 3 processes, we need to use a variety of teaching and instructional strategies. And I used 2 there at the surface for comparing and contrasting. So I was introducing comparing and contrasting with that, perhaps. And same with the concept attainment. I use that to introduce at the surface level that you have of criteria. I still like to get kids to come up and make their own criteria. How do you make criteria? So I don't always have to offer that to them. How can they work together as a group to create it? But that gets more into the deep, into the transfer part. But I want to make sure they have a good understanding of what criteria is. And there are all kinds of strategies available out there. I know you guys, many of you have been teaching for a long time. You have lots at your disposal. It's nice just to pause though and be intentional about where am I going to use this teaching approach and at what level and for what purpose and what do I want to have come out of this. And it gives us really power as teachers to decide where we're taking our kids. When you stop and think about it, I could have told my kids, given a definition for a criteria and say, here's what a criteria is. But then I took away their opportunity to think about it, to compare. I could have thrown in a situation where they're working in groups, there's collaboration and so on. So once again, the instructional approach is so important as you move students through this curriculum.
And I think the points that Ted's brought forward here, especially the examples that you're seeing, those are also engagement strategies. And we talk about how do we engage kids? How do we get them involved in my classes and lessons? These are great strategies that we can use to not only engage them, get them up, doing it in a different way than they've ever seen before, but they're also learning exactly the concepts and practicing those tools that we want them to practice. So some of these are very much outlined already in a location called Project Zero. I just threw it in the chat box. If you haven't been to Project Zero, you can just Google it and you will see all of these kind of come up. They'll come up in categories for you. And the very first category is called the cores. And a lot of the ones that you're seeing listed here are cores. And by that, they're just saying these are kind of foundational and engagement and learning strategies that you could use. And then we're going to build on them. And then the remaining categories you see would be if I want to do a deeper dive in a concept, if I want to do a collaborative communication piece, if I want to do one where there's a comparison. So there are different kinds of engagements that I would use purposefully in different scenarios, depending on what kind of concept skill I'm really trying to target with the students. So they're fun. I use a lot of these. The kids love them. And there also can be onerous if you try and do too many of them. You really need to find one that matches your teaching style, that works well with that subject, because these go across any subject. Which one is working well for you? Which one did the kids really respond to? Which one, oh, that, didn't go. And the first time round may not be the good telltale. You need to try it a couple of times. And that's why I say you don't do a ton of them. You don't change one every day. You just kind of pick one and maybe go with it every second day and just put snippets in until they start to get really used to it. So if I go into a class now and the kids have been with me for a while and I say, we're doing a 4 corners, they already know what to do. They're up, they're out, they're going, they've got their cards. They know the routine of what's going to happen. And they also know how the dialogue is going to go with that. And they also know that I expect some report that's going to come out of that. So again, I don't have to do a traditional stand up and deliver, or just the typical kind of sharing of information with paper. I can do it, but in a different context. So you're really looking at intentionality, and I think that's what Ted's really getting at. And his examples today of the skill concepts, I really want to hammer on that one today because I haven't had that opportunity. All the ones that we've done so far have been lots of concepts. And I'm not saying there aren't concepts in this one, knowledge concepts, but the skill concepts are by far in grade 4 up there. Like they're in your face, and we have to do something with those. You cannot just take a bunch of facts, because you could cover the facts in one day if that's what you want to do. It's how are you teasing out their understanding and their ability to use that factual knowledge and analyze it or critique it or compare it or whatever. So those will be big pieces that we really want to spend some time on.
Chris, if you could just click on this, I'm going to take 2 seconds because you've
absolutely.
got a whole lot of wonderful examples to share, but this is just available to you, made available to you. It's a planning tool. I really filled it in based on the activities that I did. There's some drop-down menus. You could pick your outcomes. I picked those 2 already because that was that's what I was focusing on with the comparison contrast. That's what I want to do, but I also want to know that I got to can't hit it all. So I began with the comparison contrast. But if you scroll down, I do know that one of the competencies is to analyze complex issues and ideas based on criteria I help to develop. So, that might be one of the things. And when we compare these animals, what would be some criteria we can do? So that's one of the competencies I build in. I apply appropriate language conventions. What I was looking for kids was I was going to combine it with the writing component as well. And hopefully that would be another thing. So when we take a look, there's a drop-down menu for some of the key concepts that you may thought, I want to focus on these things. I want to help kids learn those. These are all from the life skills grade 4. So you can say, here's what I want to do. I don't think, no, those aren't the grade 4 ones. Sorry, I got to click them in. Those are grade 3. But some other ones that weren't on that list are criteria, comparison, contrast. So I chose criteria as one that I wanted to choose. I wanted to focus on the skill of compare and contrast. You can scroll down to that. I listed the list of all the different skills and skill words that come out of the skills and procedures list there. So if you use that drop-down menu, you can see the skills there. Those are all taken out of the grade 4. Just to remind you of different instructional approaches, there's a list that are on the drop-down menu there if you want. And as you go along, then you could fill in what you're doing or how you do it. You could use this as a planner, and you could use it as a sort of a record of where you've been. So when it comes to report card time, you kind of know what you've covered and where you've been. You could put resources. So I put a link into the compare contrast exercise that I did, some assessment things. You can use this if you want. You don't have to. Some people like using it. Some people like using paper in their own style. That's fair enough, but it's just something there. There's all the outcomes, everything all in one spot. Even has a link to the concept map there. It's on the bottom tab or the link at the top. So there's the concept map associated with grade 4 living systems as well.
That's awesome. And that will be in your folder, and it will be available to download. And it wouldn't just be for this organizing idea. It would be one that you would be able to have access to then for every other organizing idea that you're going to teach throughout grade 4. Are there any questions so far? Any comments? Just want to make sure that we're giving you a chance here. If something came to mind that you saw and we're not sure, we didn't explain it well. Okay, you're going to find that amazing planning folder in our Moving Forward website, the one that you logged in for your cohort session 1. That's where you're going to find session 2 and session 3 and session 4. So everything that we do today will be in the Moving Forward Curriculum.ca folder. So you just use your login that you already set up. You just choose science cohort grade 4, and then you'll see the folders are in there already, session 1, and now there's going to be a session 2. And well, everything that we share with you in the sessions will always go into those folders. So, and I talk about this at the end, but I'm going to do it now. You don't have to go in there in a panic and worry, oh yeah, I've got to download all the stuff, it's going to disappear. It's there permanently. It's going to be there in perpetuity. Like, we're not, that the videos are not timed so that they disappear or whatever. So you have the ability just to go in and out and get the materials when you need them. And as Ted and I are going through, we've been even talking today that as we start going through and finding materials in other grades, I'm coming across materials saying, you know what, that's really great. I could have put that into the grade 4 folder too. So we'll always be adding things in there. We're not necessarily going to send you an email every time and say there's a bunch of new materials. So you may go in the folder now and you see that there's an assessment piece in there, and then 2 days from now or 2 weeks from now, you find, oh, there's 2 in there. So you just have to check back. Not everybody is doing living systems as their first unit. And so you may not even be doing this until after Christmas. It depends on how you set up your schedule and for your year. So we recognize that too, that not everybody is going to be vested in coming to every one of these sessions right now, because I'm not doing living systems, or some teachers are only doing a quarter of the year. So I'm not teaching till December. So they may just not go back in until it's such time that they're going to teach that. So that's where you'll find everything. You just log in there and we'll post everything in there. I'm going to just give you an overview right now of kind of how I could see one way of rolling this out. And both Ted and I have the advantage of going through from kindergarten, and we're seeing how everything's linking together. And I see lots of overlap between grade 3 and grade 4 for sure. So those of you who are teaching a 3-4 split, you're in a bonus year this year because you really can make that work well. There's so many things that flow right from 3 into 4 and could be done with both groups at the same time. So when we're looking at these, that structures and functions is a big piece of grade 4. And that really are the, I guess, the 2 big concepts that stood out all the way through for me, whether we're talking about right at the beginning of just what is just the basic external features of something. It's still, what is the structure? What is it made of? What's holding it together? And then what does it do? Why do we have it? And what does it do for the animal or for the plant? There are a few things in here, and I'll point that out as I go through, but there are a few places in this curriculum that I'm finding we need some clarification. So I have sent off some questions to Alberta Ed because I don't think we have good clarity as to how deep they want us to go, especially under the word classify. It's very vague, and I mean, we can go into classifications, and I'm certainly not thinking of a high school level, but there are definitely deeper than just generalities. And yet it seems to be just generalities that we're looking for. So a little bit of clarification from that, maybe we'll get that. So overall, because we're jumping into grade 4 and we're going to be talking about features of animals and plants, and specifically, we really want them to see, what do they know about Alberta? And for some students, you know, as Ted says, you know, you want to give them opportunities to talk about Alberta, and then maybe you want to give them a big idea to transfer their thinking to go outside of Alberta and maybe even into another country to see how they might compare some animals. For some of our students in rural Alberta, depending on where you're teaching, their world might be very small, right? They've only seen a very, very small group. They maybe have never been to the mountains, so they aren't even familiar with mountain animals might be. So you may not have to get really grand and go very far. You just maybe within the own province, just a completely different habitat and location that we're going to. So to start with, I'm going to suggest that we spend a little time to find out about what our kids know about Alberta animals and plants. So I've created a card sort that I'm using from grade 3 as well, because I like reusing things. So in that, it's just an opportunity for them to show us, I can name these animals because I know them. Or you may have some kids who've got a big pile of, I don't even know what these are. I've never seen them before. And yet they're all Alberta animals and plants. Then we're going to take a little bit of a closer look using those cards still, but we want to look at what are some structures? What makes the structure of a plant different than the structure of an animal? And so we want to talk a little bit about what those structures are. What do they look like? And what do you think the purposes are, right? We can do a little bit of research if we need to. And then, oh, I have that structure. What does it do for me? Why do I have it? Why does the plant have a stem? What does it have a very solid stem in some cases and not in others? So what's the function of those structures? So again, those are two huge concepts that we spend time on. And then looking at how we compare maybe the uses of those structures and how is it that we both have a mouth, but it looks different? Okay, I've got two different animals and their mouth is completely different, or one has a beak and one has a nose. And do they serve the same purpose? That's where we want to look at now. What are our external structures? And they may look different, but do they actually serve the same purpose? And do we have external structures that look different and really are very different in their purpose? And we definitely have those. The other piece that goes along with this is those structures that I have, how do I use them to help me survive in the place that I live? So depending on, again, where you are teaching right now, what kind of an environment do those kids see every day? What do they, is it a wooded area? Is it a completely flat farm area? Like, what is the habitat that the kids, the basic area that they are living in? What do they notice about that? What are they seeing about the kinds of things that animals would live in that area? What would they have to possess to make them comfortable, to survive, to find food, to be able to move around or not move around? So those are those senses. And because senses aren't kind of done way back in kindergarten and grade 1, it's been a long time since we talked about it. So even talking about what are senses, first of all, let's just review that. And then, do plants have senses? And if so, what are they? And how would they use them? How does a robin know exactly where to peck on the ground to pick out an earthworm? Like, what do they have in a sense that we don't have? So we're going to spend a little bit of time on that as well. I'm just going to grab into the other. Oh. And again, you do not need to, whoops. You do not need to screenshot these because I'm going to give you this entire slide deck. So again, this is one way of looking at how we might unpack some of the concepts that are here. And certainly if you just get some ideas from it, great. And if you want to use the slides, you're more than welcome to. But really, as I said, we're looking at structure and function. We're looking at plants and animals. So if I take those 4 words in my mind, plants, animals, structures, and functions, that really encompasses living systems in grade 4 in a nutshell, is really. And how I unpack that as a teacher will be depending on how you look at it. Like, what lens are you looking at it through? And where do you live? And what do the kids have available to them? That will determine kind of how you want to approach it. So if I look at just even different animals, I can just even start with this and just say, what do you see about these animals? Why are they different? They might say, well, one's an animal that's got horns, one's got 4 legs, one doesn't have legs that are 4, one's got wings, all those, just those obvious kinds of things. But that's really what this is all about. And so these 4 aspects of living systems in grade 4, as I say, come down to kind of 4 pieces. And I like using case studies to start some things off. And case studies can be completely useful to me as a teacher in that I'm going to pick a topic. I'm going to use that example to teach some of those important skills, concepts, and concepts for knowledge at the same time. So I'm going to try and bring parallels in. So when Ted's talking about, we have to teach the skill of conversation, or the skill of discuss, or the skill of what do you see and how would you write it down? What's my observation skills? What would I look for? I can do that when I do a case study that's common to the whole group. And then I'm going to give them the opportunity to take what we've just done and they're going to try it on a different scenario. So I'm using a case study of a house. I'm going to start with a house because I really want to get them thinking about where we're going to go. And so that will be where I'm going to go in just a bit here. But first, we're going to start with our card sort. Where do you live? You might live in a city. You might live in rural Alberta. Where do you live? What do they know? So you're going to have access to these cards. As I mentioned yesterday, there's 46 or 44 of them. and I've numbered the cards and I give you a cheat sheet. So if you see some animals that you're not familiar with either, you've got the answer key so that you can identify what they are. And it's not important that they necessarily know all of them, but I think it's important for them to realize the diversity of animals that exist within Alberta, and that we have lots to choose from, because we're going to ask them to always go back and choose, pick animal, pick a bird, pick an animal, pick a plant, and make some comparisons, right? That critical comparison of what do I see for structures and functions in here versus over here? And are there things that are common? Are there things that are very different? So those are the kinds of pieces that we're going to look at. So the first thing I would just have them do is, do they know the difference between plants and animals? And hopefully they do, but that comes in grade 2, right? That was a grade 2 concept. And so just have them sort them into piles. And then you might want to go one step further and say, you could take each of the piles, and I would do them in teams of 2s or 3s or whatever. Just take your piles and could you resort them? And that's where I would be vague. I would just say resort them. Resort them into some kind of category or criteria that your group decided you're going to put piles in. They might say, I'm putting all the 4-legged things together. I'm putting all the things that have feathers together. Right? And we can walk around and say, how did you decide what you were going to put in each of those groups? That gets to the criteria piece. What did you use to decide what was going to go into each of those piles? So we can start to tease that out, but also to bring attention to them that these animals are not all the same. Some have feathers, some have fur, some don't have any legs at all. And so where are they going to go, right? So having them deliberately have a conversation in their groups about how they're going to identify the criteria, and then did they stick to the criteria? And did all the groups in the class come up with the same kind of criteria, or were there some that came up with something completely different, right? Those are other ways that we might want to do that. And then, do they know the names of the animals and the plants that they put in each of their groups? They might have a, we know all of these pile, we don't know any of these pile. Yes, no kind of ways. So again, it gives you a conversation piece to have with the students. How many of us know these? And maybe we can go and talk to another group and let's talk to them and say, what did you guys put in your don't know pile? Oh, well, we know what that one is. We can tell you. And we had this, oh, we know that one too. So getting them to share with each other first. And then if we still have a pile, then we have that conversation as a class and say, let's hold up the ones that were causing us some problems. Let's see if we can figure out what they are. And maybe we can even say, oh, I know where they are. I saw those when I was in. So now we can even talk about, where do they live? Where do they see those animals? I don't see a black bear. I live in Red Deer. I don't see black bears, but oh, I went to the mountains. I've seen black bears there, right? So that we just start to get that conversation going. All that conversation maybe seem like loosey-goosey, but it all ties into everything that they have to do in structure function as we go through this particular unit. So let's talk about a house. Okay, how is a house like a plant or an animal? And I might just throw the question out before I even show them a picture. And then you may not get a response to that. You might get people to say, well, like you had to build stuff, you know, and animals are built out of things. And I'd say, are they built out of things? And you can have that conversation about what it is that's different about animals and plants and an inanimate object like a house. But I am getting to a point where I really, and I would not, I'm just throwing this down here for you as teachers, just so you have a sense if you watch this, you know, a long time down the road. But really, I would show them 4 houses. And I might say to them, let's look at these 4 houses. What do you see that's different about their appearance, right? We're talking about appearance. How do they vary? What do you see? You know, I see a stone. I see a house that is made out of canvas and it has supports that are wood. I see a house that seems to be made out of just all wood. Doesn't look like it has anything else on it. I see a house that's got some stone. It's got some brick on it in the front. It might have some wood. I can't see that from here. This one doesn't look like it has. It looks like they all have glass on the outside for windows. And then we can say, okay, so we see all these different appearances. So what do you think those are for? What do you think the function of those is, right? So just getting them to do the everyday kinds of things they see of windows. So I can look out of them. Windows keep the cold air from coming in. It gives us insulation. So having that basic conversation of a house, because later we're going to transfer that to an animal, right? So we really want to dive deep and let them exhaust it. You could have chalk talk, and that's one of the Project Zero kinds of things that you can do. A chalk talk means you might have appearance up on a poster paper, and the groups get to walk around and they write down what they wrote down for appearance, and then they look at everything that everybody else says, and oh, no one wrote down what I have, so we're going to add on to the bottom. So the whole class is building the appearance of the house. What are the things that you saw about the appearance of the house? And then we can start talking about structure. What do you think made this house? What do you think it's made of? So it looks like it has wood on the outside, so it must have been made of wood. It's got wood in there, right? We're only looking on external structures, not internal. So again, we have that same conversation. And then where is this house located? What's its habitat? And it seems odd to ask that about a house, but where is it living? It looks like this one probably is in a city, because I don't see any indication that it could be on an acreage, but I don't have any really good ideas that number one is really out there. Number two could be, I see some farmland, I see some bush in the background, so I get some sense of where this might be, and so on and so on. So again, just getting them to be aware of what they see around the outside, because if you're going to take them outside in the schoolyard, we want them to be attuned to what specifically are they seeing around the playground. What do they see outside the fence? What do they see if you've got bush near the place, if you've got a walking place where you can take some water, and so on. So we are really just looking at everything from appearance to structure and function. What's the purpose of a window? What's the purpose of a door? And hopefully you got all those listed on your sheets. What's the purpose of a step? No step, right? Like purpose of an outdoor light. So just really being observant about what I see on the house and what I can get from there. Because now I want to take them to their first opportunity to go back to their cards. And I want them to do that same sort of surface level, pick two animals that look somewhat different. And can you give us an appearance? What is their appearance? Why did you pick those two? One is big, small, one is got legs, one doesn't have legs, right? So just talking about the general appearance. One has fur, one doesn't have fur. So again, at the top here, I put students can select pictures outside the card deck. Maybe they live in a specific area and they're very familiar with a certain animal. And it's always nice to start with something I'm familiar with because I feel comfortable with that. Let them do that. Who cares? They can just write the name on there and then they can describe it. Now we get to do something description instead of seeing the picture. So in this case, we want to look at all of those three things that we just talked about, and we want to talk about the external structures. So just like we said, we had doors and windows. What does your animal have? Well, they have 4 legs, they have a tail, they have 2 ears. You know, describe the structures of your animal. And how does that relate to the other animal that you picked? Maybe I picked the snake, has no legs. Doesn't look like it has any ears that I can see, just has holes on the sides. Maybe those are the ears, right? Has a bigger mouth and a funny looking tongue. I don't see my cow spitting their tongue out all the time. So just those kinds of observations that we want them to have. And that's a skill that they need to know, is how to observe something and how to record it. So the habitat that they live in, and what would the animal see, hear, and experience in that habitat? So often students will say they live in a forest. Okay, what kind of forest is it? Is it forest with lots of evergreen trees around? Because then we can figure out, do they know the difference with the kinds of trees? Is it a forest where there's lots of deep underbrush, or there's lots of other animals? What would they hear? Are they close to people? Like all of those things we want them to dig deep into. And then we're going to do the same thing with plants. Pick 2 plants. And again, if it's not in the cards, what's around them that they're familiar with? Talk about the characteristics of the plants. This is the great big tree. It's got a great big trunk on it. This is a tiny little bush, and it just has really small little trunks that are coming off of it, or branches that are coming off of it, right? So getting them to be observant again and listing those pieces so that they can start to be really attuned to what they're seeing. Again, these are not, there's no way we can unpack every lesson that we would do here, but I would do this with students before I would have them do their cards. So I would go through another example. I would say, let's look at a chokecherry bush. And some of them might chime in and say, hey, yeah, we got chokecherries on our farm, right? But the chokecherry bush, that's all over Alberta. It's a leafy tree. You know, I might not see it from here, but that's typically kind of got a trunk on it, but some pretty skinny kind of branches that come off of it. It has black cherries on it, which are also the seeds. We want them to be able to talk about, it's got cherries, but what are those cherries? They're also the seeds that are going to help us grow another. So that cycle of life, right? That we talked about in the other grade, as opposed to my eagle, which has 2 feet, has really sharp claws on the end of them, talons, has a beak. You know, I don't see a beak on my face, I see a nose, but how does that compare? So again, it's making that observation with the kids together before we start getting them to do their work on their own. What are the functions of those things we just talked about? The beak, the talons, the web, the feathers, the wings, the legs, and all of those different components. What are the functions of the berries? Lots of children don't connect berries with being the seeds. They eat the berries, but they don't themselves realize that that's really the seeds that they're going to use for that cycle of the growth of a plant. So there's lots that can be done with very little in the classroom. You can take a lot of this outside and make it very engaging, or have them even bring pictures from home. Here's the tree I just took a picture of in my front yard. Let's unpack it. What is it? Let's talk about it. And then going to move a bit forward, as Ted was saying, we want to get some comparisons happening here. So what do we notice about structures and functions of animals? Are there things that are the same? Are there things that are common to all animals? Yes, there's differences, but are there some commonalities? They all have to eat. So is there a common way that they eat? Is there a common way that they hunt? Is there a common way that they breathe? And so on. And then the same thing with plants. Do all plants have some things in common? So I have a number of resources built into the slide deck that you would be able to use. Again, it depends on where kids are at and what their interests are. Some kids are into plants. Some kids could care less about plants and they really want to learn about animals. And I always let them choose to start with, because if they're more engaged in my first choice, they can all pick animals and then we'll all do plants later, but let them choose. So in here, we've just got some characteristics of how I would classify different kinds of plants. So again, if I don't know how to classify, and classifications, remember I said, is one that we need some clarification on, because the classify, normally we did them in groups a little bit more specific than what's here. The one that's over on the right hand side, you'll see I put a note here, stop it after the general plant description, because it gets into the high school level. So we don't want to get that deep either. So somewhere in between here, I suspect, is where grade 4 is going to fall, but we don't really have that clarity. So you could even not do a plant example like I did, and the chokecherry and the eagle. Maybe you show them 2 videos, one on the characteristics of animals and one on the characteristics of plants. And then we have the conversation. Or we come back day 2 and we start with the video. So we did card sort one day, the video the next, just to refresh my memory. And then we go back and start working again. So if we move on to, as we were talking, structures may look different, but do they have the same purpose? So we can say that you name that you have a nose. Does the cat have a nose? Yes. Does the eagle have a nose? Let's talk about that. Is the beak where he breathes out of? And the answer would be yes, he does. He has some air nostrils in there. So that's where the quote breathing comes from. Do they have a head? They have eyes. So what are the components that are the same regardless of what animal I'm talking about? And then what are the things that really sort of separate them out and make them very different? And it doesn't have to be deep and big pictures. Same thing with plants. What's the basic parts of a plant? Again, you're not getting into the cotyledons and all of those pieces. You don't have to get into it that deeply. It's not bad, because those are still not deep functioning or deep concepts. And it would be okay for definitely students to get a little bit further, but we're not getting into the whole analysis of chlorophyll and or the photosynthesis. We're not getting into that. They should know that sun energy happens, and that's how they make their food, through the process of photosynthesis. But the unpacking of photosynthesis, we would not expect them to do. So again, the parts of the plant, this is a really nice one if they just need a refresher on, okay, let me show them again how it is. They show them some actual time-lapse photography, which is always interesting for the kids. And then they can see how those grow. So again, much like what Ted showed you in the sample, I want to start moving towards how are they starting to think about what some things are common. So I want to get into pick some organisms that you haven't picked yet. Let's go back into our card sort. Pick out something again that's completely different than you did before. Pick out some animals, 3 animals and 2 plants, right? The plants are always a little bit sparse in there. You could always add more pictures in. And then how does that organism that you picked eat? How does it move? How does it protect itself? So plants sometimes close up at night when it gets cold. Sometimes they wither down, and then as soon as the sun comes, they come back out again. Even their stems will start to get more turgor and pressure in them, right? So what are the things that we're looking at that they protect themselves with? Some animals give off a terrible smell, like we could talk about a skunk, right? So that's a protection. So there might be some research involved here, or maybe they know lots about that animal. Again, we want to move them away from just only what they know to an animal that maybe they have to do a little bit of work and look into. And then we want to get into what are the sensory pieces that animals and plants possess, and how does that play into their external structure and their protection of themselves and where they live? Why do they need that particular sense to be heightened where they live, where another animal doesn't have that? So what are the characteristics of that animal that has that need to have that sense or that sensory opportunity? So again, when I talk about these, we're just open-ended questions, and some of the kids might not know the answer to these. Maybe we don't know all the answers to these. This would be one that I would actually do through a case study. I would throw these questions out and say, what role does gravity have in a plant's day-to-day life? And they'd probably say, what do you mean gravity? Like, who cares about gravity? Well, a plant certainly does. And there's a reason that we ask that question. But we could take small groups of students to take each one of these and delve into it, and then find examples and do some comparisons to come back and teach the class and say, here's what we found, and these are the terms and the things that we would use to compare and describe and to analyze those two scenarios, right? So I would start with just a refresher. This is what we learned in grade 2, that our senses send information to our brain to help our bodies understand and perceive the world around us. What does that mean? Let's just talk about what it means, first of all, so that we are all on the same page about what a sense is. Because a lot of times if you say senses, they'll say, oh, it's your hearing and your speaking and your listening. And okay, but what are those? What are they doing? Why are they important to us, right? Because they send information to our brain so that we connect with what's happening. So we want to have just a conversation about that. What wonders do you have? Okay, these are the questions that I just showed them. So maybe we say, I want you to get together in a group of 3, and we're going to draw out and we're going to say you're going to get a question from here. And maybe we generate some more questions of wonders that they have in structures and function, right? That's our focus that we want to do. Again, they could be the case study. They're going to grab some animals, they're going to do the investigation on whatever side they're working on, or they're going to do some research, or both, right? Maybe they have to do both of those. Or one of the other skill requirements is that they do an experiment. What are the things in my habitat that I need to survive? Let's do an experiment if we maybe changed or altered one of those basic needs that we have. And if you don't have a lot of resources to do that, I did provide you with an experiment that has been done. So they get to watch part 1 where the experiment is set up, and then it's a part 2 where they would come back and say, okay, our plant's been growing for quite a while. Here's what happened. And then you could even stop the video and say, that's what happened. Why do you think that happens? Before they even tell the kids what it is. Why did that happen? What happened in the structure and the function of that plant before they were able to make those decisions? So I've also included for you a little bit of what we put in with grade 3, because so much of that carries into grade 4. So this is where if they don't have that knowledge from grade 3, they might be at a bit of a disadvantage this year. So we might want to combine a little bit of the work that was done there. And if you're dividing them up in small groups, then each one could take one of those that are relevant to them. So again, here were some videos or some resource materials on senses that animals have, or on senses that plants have, because I don't think kids realize that plants have senses as well. And so this entire page is a resource page.
Which animal has the best?
I've created another one specific to grade 4 that really launches more into the structure and function, which is really what we want to keep our focus to. And so talking about animal senses, talking about scent behavior, you know, how is it that a bear knows that there's somebody coming a long way away, and we're downwind from or upwind from the bear, so he's smelling our scent, right? What is all that all about, right? So having that. New research on plant intelligence. is now changing how people think about plants, that plants have more senses in the environment that we ever gave them credit for. So again, these are pieces that we can assign to students to bring back to our overall discussion of structure and function.
Plants are often.
I also included a piece on habitats in case we needed a bit of a refresher. Again, this comes from grade 3, but again, we need a little bit of help on just reminding ourselves sort of in Alberta typically what we might be looking for. I also included that boreal forest and the hinterland boreal forest information. So if a student is working on where they live, then they might want to explore a few of these to really figure out, oh, that's my animal, that's where they live. This is the world that they live in. And then going back to our chart that we had before, I've added another column to it, is what sense does that animal possess to help survive, to help find food, to help protect itself? Like, how does it use its senses every day in a sort of normal routine? And then transfer, right? We could now say, let's pick some organism that is unfamiliar to them. So maybe it's a completely different habitat from where they live right now. Or maybe if they're not quite comfortable yet, let's pick one that's in your area that they haven't talked about. And maybe we pick one in the mountain if they've never been to a mountain before, so that they can do some conversations and have some comparisons. Again, I'm leaving this very open. I would suggest a case study. Maybe they do a case study because now they've seen how a case study works. So they present a case study to you, and how that format looks would be up to you to decide how you want them to do it. Is it going to be a presentation where maybe they make their own little video? Maybe they are reading you a report, or there's whatever way you're trying to encourage them. And then what is your rubric that you're going to use for the assessment pieces that go along with that? I also included a couple of extra slides that may or may not, depending on where your conversations go. And if you're feeling that they're still not sort of catching on to the fact that their habitat may be they may be in trouble with the habitat, we might want to take them back a little bit and think about how are we good stewards of the land, and how do we help our animals to be healthy and live in the worlds that they do. And then there's a whole piece in here which is from the grade 3, because it is not addressed specifically in grade 4, but there is so much to be tied into this from grade 3. So I've given you a lot of slides on resources that deal specifically with First Nations. And this book right here is about a 288-page book on science and First Nations. It has great links in it. You can just download it. It's free. There's no copyright violation there. And then this is an oral reading story as well. Here are some other links to the Earth and First Nations beliefs that, again, you may have these resources in your school. If you don't, you could always use the ones that are linked here. And you don't need any of those. This is a summing up. We got good feedback on this with the kindergarten grade 1-2 teachers. And so I've just been including it all the way through. If you want something like this, a graphic organizer, these are editable. You can go in and download it from the folder, and you can type into any box. You can add more boxes in. So it's already done. You don't have to, you can change the title. I just put Summing My Thinking. Maybe that's what you want to use as your summative for them to do a comparison, like however you want to set it up or not use it. I'm just throwing extra resources out there. The other one is Sparklebox. A lot of the diagrams that I've given you come from Sparklebox. I can't give you tons from there because it is copyrighted material to be used in a presentation. But as a teacher, you can download and use in your class unlimited amounts. So let me throw that into the chat box for you to grab. There's no cost to sign up. There's not even a login for it. And it's very easy to use. You can go up into their search bar. You could put in animal features and you'll get a whole bunch of them that come up. That one that I showed you that had the owl and the kitty cat, that came from there. So they have lots of worksheets. If you're just trying to see, I want them to know the basic structure of a plant, and it already has the boxes. They're all editable. So you don't have to create a ton of things. Most of it is there for you, and just use whatever's there rather than reinvent the wheel on ourselves. And then, oops, sorry. I also am going to include in here a rubric. So BC we were supposed to roll out our new curriculum with BC, and we were very much online with them at the same time. This is the rubric that they came up with for science and technology. It works very well. So if you are looking for sort of a consistent rubric to use, regardless of what grade it is, you could use something like that with the students as well, and you could always edit it if you wanted to. But it's about a 2.5 page document, and it's going to be in your folder that you'll have access to that as well. Okay, so that's the end of that one. And so I will put that entire slide deck in there, and you're welcome to use or not use whatever is helpful to you. I guess we're just kind of grasping right now to give you some things so that you're not feeling like you're walking away without anything and not know where to start with this, since we don't have a resource to go with it. So the recording will be in your folder as well. Again, you can go back and watch it. So if you're not doing this for a long time down the road, oh, that's not correct. It's not November 2nd. I didn't change that last night. My apologies. I think our next one is on the 9th, if I'm correct. And just want to remind you that the next one will be on Matter. That will be our next organizing idea. And we will put all of the shared resources, anything like the planner that Ted had, that will be in your folders as well. So if you have things that you're willing to share and you would like to put them in a shared folder in there, please send them to us and we'll get them in there for sure. We also want to point out to you that we have been talking with Gizmos, and you may or may not be familiar with Gizmos, but we do have the license to use those again. And so we have, you will see posted very, very shortly, probably Monday morning, in the CARC website. You can go there. There will be general sessions for Gizmos. So if you have never gone on there yet, and you don't have a login, and you've never set yourself up with Gizmos, it's free, then you should take one of those sessions that'll be offered in October. The one that we're pointing out to you is Science Pilot Teachers. So anybody who's registered from K to 6 in Science Pilot, we have reserved October 26th. At the same time we're doing this, as one of the days where they're going to come in and show you how to code. So it's a day for the teacher. It's not a day for the kids. It's no expectation that you're taking this back next day to teach the kids. It's a day where you've got your logins. Now we just really, really want to play with a little bit of coding and show you how to get that started, because there's been lots of angst around that if you've never done it before. And then they'll show you how it links in. We'll also start linking the gizmos that fit to grade 4 organizing idea living systems. So we're going to go through, review those, and say these ones work really well. So a gizmo is just an interactive platform where it meets the outcome that you're already going to teach, and the kids can go in and actually do some work hands-on. They love gizmos. And they're good. They're really, really good. So again, you could do that instead of an activity of worksheet type of thing. You just take them and put them on their Chromebooks, and they go from there. So those are kind of important pieces to put in there. And for those who were not here yesterday, I also pointed out that there are also other opportunities available for coding if you are wanting to do a little bit on your own. This is a scenario where there's an offer out. This is an Alberta firm. I'll put it in the chat box. It's set up for grade 1 to grade 9. You would register your class, and they'd bring you a little robot that they will teach you how to code as a class. So the teacher learns with the students alongside. So if it's something you want to look into, you can just click it on. There is a write-up there. It gives you a bit of a sense of what it's all about. Okay, and that takes us to the end. So are there any questions? And I guess I didn't ask it yesterday, but I'm going to ask today. You're not going to hurt our feelings by saying this is really not what I was hoping these were about, but if this is helpful to you, what we're bringing to you for the session, this would be good for us to know. If it's not, and you would like more of something else, then you need to just let us know that. Like, again, you're not going to hurt our feelings by saying, no, this is okay. Gives me information to get started, or no, this is not really what I want. So giving us that feedback would be really helpful as well. Are there any questions? Anything that we didn't cover, or you have questions about anything we said? Okay, I'm just going to stop recording here.